hour course on, so I'm not going to do that. I'll just direct people to the fact that there was a 13-hour course that is available on Los Altos Institute's podcast channel on the history of green politics as a phenomenon. 2 episodes are me apologizing for my role as leader of the Green Party of British Columbia, but which of course is now controlled by its pro-fracking faction. So anyway, the trans pro-fracking faction, they got it all in one thing. Nicholas Sperling, nominated as the candidate for Coquitlam Millardville, and spent the first day of his campaign flashing his penis at people in a parking lot in Coquitlam. Announced was going out without wearing underwear to flash people to celebrate his nomination as the Coquitlam Millardville candidate. And naturally, all of our mainstream media said, "You're so brave." Anyway, so this expresses one of my problems at this meeting, which is half the reason I'm here is to unpack all the cancellation and madness and gender wang that has wrecked my life and to get support from this group. The other half of the reason I'm here is to get back on topic. So this very short talk is me trying to get back on topic. And I want to share with you some fairly abstract intellectual work that I've been doing that was part of the history of green politics course that I taught, but also part of 2 other courses that I taught that I think we're really set up for here with this view out the window. So what I want to do is give you 10 minutes on landscape as a category and its relationship to fundamental contradictions in the environmental and conservation movements. And so that's kind of my purpose here. So first of all, look out the window, and one of the things that our kind hosts have been apologizing for is the abbreviated nature of our view of the beautiful landscape that is out this window. And I really lucked in not only that we have a big picture window, but also that we have sheep here, because this can now give us the origins of landscape as a category. Landscape enters the English language in the 1560s as a word. It's a loan word, landschap, and it means vista that looks like a Dutch landscape painting. So landscape is not a thing we found in the natural world and then created art about. In the English-speaking tradition, we found the art and then sought to make it in the natural world. So why is this? Well, it's because England and the Netherlands had very similar economic and religious revolutionary experiences in the late Middle Ages and early modern period. In the 1320s, there's a climate downturn, which moves a bunch of rats around, which causes the Black Death, and 1/3 of Europe's population dies. But it's not just that 1/3 of Europe's population dies. Europe gets colder, wetter winters, unlike the Little Ice Age, which gives it colder, drier winters 200 years later. The 1320s, it's colder, wetter winters. So your labor force is collapsing. You've lost 1/3 of your labor force, and you have these terrible winters that are unlike previous cold winters because of these higher levels of precipitation. And this produces a technological change. It used to be that Europeans, the way they dressed themselves during most of the Middle Ages is they primarily wore fabrics like linen, which were labor-intensive fabrics. And the big advantage of them was that the number of layers you had controlled your temperature. So you could very precisely modulate your body temperature. And also there was a life cycle to linen and these other things. You started out using them as clothing. When the clothing fell apart, you used them as wrapping material. When they were all grease stained, you then used them as informal writing material if you couldn't afford parchment or vellum. So, but flax was also the latitude at which it could be cultivated was moving south. There was less territory you could grow flax in order to make linen. And so the rise of wool. Previous to this, there were no season-specific garments. You didn't switch your fashion seasonally. You switched your amount of clothes seasonally. But we developed these season-specific garments because, of course, wool carding and sheep herding takes vastly less labor. But the reason they're able to do it is depopulation. They put sheep on lands previously occupied by humans. And the margins of the profits you can make in the wool trade in the 1300s, they get bigger and bigger. And so when the climate starts actually kind of getting a bit better, the wool trade is going gangbusters, and it's going all the way south. The Medicis have got sheep in Italy. They're in the wool trade now. And so you have a massive competition. This is a lot of what creates the Hanseatic League, this network of port cities. The port cities are self-governed by the new emergent class, the bourgeoisie, the gentry. And the gentry, and then there are political changes. In the Netherlands, there's the Dutch Revolt on the basis of Calvinist Protestantism. In England, the Tudors seize power and then convert to Calvinist Protestantism, which is the trendy religion of the gentry. And one of the features but these are unstable regimes. They're up against long-term Catholic power. And so they have to disempower the aristocracy and empower the bourgeoisie. And they do this through a process called enclosure. Enclosure is both a legal and physical process. The physical elements of enclosure are you enclose land with fences so the sheep don't leave it. And that reduces the number of shepherds you have to employ controlling the sheep. The other half of enclosure, though, is the conversion of feudal titled land to fee simple title land. And this is a radical shift because if the king decides, oh, my alienated public land in the hand of this lord doesn't belong in the hands of this lord, of course, the lord will try and fight the king. He might win, he might lose. But what does the new lord get when they get the new land? The land comes with all the peasants on it. And the peasants now have an obligation to you to raise their crops and give you a share. The gentry don't receive land in feudal title. They receive land in fee simple title, which means you buy the land, not the people. And so from very early on, this produces massive dispossession and dislocation. People are forced off the feudal lands, they're forced off the common lands, and there's massive privatization and this creation of this new way of holding land where the land doesn't come with the labor and it doesn't come with any obligations. And as Thomas More says in his book of social criticism, Utopia, it used to be that we were a country in which men ate sheep, but now sheep eat men. Because the people who've lost the land, they become a new kind of thing. They arrive in communities where they don't know anybody, where they have no historical associations. And we take an obscure word from the Kentish language called neighbor, which means person who lives near you, but that you don't know for some reason. Why would that even be? And so because they don't want to create welfare programs to help any of these people, instead what they do in England is they rewrite the Bible and they take out the word brother and insert this new word neighbor every time it refers to a material obligation to someone. That's why some of us who are really old grew up still borrowing sugar from the people who live next door because they were obliged to give you sugar if you ran out while you were baking cookies because the Bible told them to. So this rise of the neighbor, actually, we know this. The Nobel Committee got really excited by this about 20 years ago. The UN got really excited by this. What we called it was female-led microcredit. But really, it's the Tudor monarchy in England that creates female-led microcredit as a way of removing a social program and not replacing it. So how does this create landscape? Well, what a landscape is is a vista that used to be inhabited by people who were replaced by sheep. Staples of a landscape are a reduction in tree cover, increase in grass cover, the presence of ruined human settlements, and all of these other criteria. And what the bourgeoisie did brilliantly was they aestheticized the process of destroying people's lives. They made the physical manifestation of the destruction of communities an incredibly popular art form. And this art form spread and it shaped our consciousness. And when it got to the New World, it was put on steroids because the virgin soil epidemics that hit indigenous populations in Western North America meant that there were all kinds of places that already looked like landscapes, where there were already ruined cottages with no one living in them, and the buffalo moving in to flatten that landscape. And that's the world that's discovered when they build the big train lines west, when Ulysses S. Grant finances transcontinental railroads. And people love this idea, and there's this movement, Ralph Waldo Emerson's movement, the movement of John Muir, the people who give you the Sierra Club. They're originally the Seeker movement. They're a spiritualist movement that believes in that the way you contact the divine is to go into a landscape or to view a landscape and experience a theophany, because there are no people there. The people have already been deleted. It's just you and God as expressed through nature. Now, of course, these are anthropogenic landscapes like any other landscape. They're human-created landscapes, but the action of humans in the landscape is to disinhabit them, to depopulate them. And it's from there that you get to Muir and Emerson supporting the genocide in Yosemite and the use of the machine guns to destroy the indigenous people to create the first great parks in America, and the forced marches of the Nez Perce out of Yellowstone, and these massive disinhabitation efforts, which the railway companies need, because it's very expensive to send the trains up through all this territory that has no mineral value on it, no one living there, nothing to exploit, and no labor to exploit it. What can we do? We'll put a hotel there. And then the seekers will come to the hotel and they will experience landscape, and they will have their theophany, and they will have their union with the divine. And this, we're sad to say, is fundamentally, from a genealogical perspective, the origin of our movement. These are our ancestors. This is our movement 150 years ago. It's this genocidal aesthetic bourgeois movement that is obsessed with the creation of this special thing called landscape. And so I began developing this analysis when I was in Williams Lake, British Columbia, and I was doing organizing for the BC Green Party in the 90s there. And back then it was the capital of the Share movement. It was one of the towns that had banned Greenpeace. And our organizer there had been Daryl Grams, this wildlife population biologist who had worked at Banff and had worked all through Canada's national park system. And this was during the Harcourt government's effort to hit the UN 12% protected area target. And of course, overwhelmingly what's being protected is alpine. And what Daryl said to me, he said, I know I had to quit all that and get involved in some sort of radical environmental movement, because I realized that Banff National Park was the rational capitalist response to an alpine area with no mineral deposits. If there are no trees to cut, if there's no ore to mine, how do you maximize human activity and environmental exploitation on that land? You put a fence around it and you call it a park. And that park creation, which we've often conflated with an environmental agenda, is associated with two highly problematic things: disinhabitation, and while concurrently disinhabiting the landscape and increasing the human impact on it. And we're now seeing this in my jurisdiction, reordering the whole of the hinterland. Our old neo-feudal tree farm license system that required forest companies to maintain mills and towns and schools and things, all of those things have been removed. And so even in the industrial resource periphery of British Columbia, most of the towns are in demographic decline, not just because of the fall down effect and the fact that we overcut the forests, but by the fact that we are going back and we are replacing towns with camps. We're bringing back the man camps, we're bringing back the mining camps. And these camps are so horrific that a researcher in Dakota found, if you look at temporary fracking camps and fracking locations and the man camps that manage those wells, you can do predictive murder maps of racialized women. And so what we're seeing is disinhabitation and landscape creation is actually the plague that is crossing this continent, that we are taking inhabited spaces and turning them into landscapes and then using their disinhabitation to make our resource extraction even more intense and egregious. So I wanted to suggest that one of the things I think we have to struggle with is the idea that we come out of this John Muir Sierra Club paradigm that built all this. But I think one of the things we have to start talking about is reversing disinhabitation and talking about reinhabitation, understanding that there is no such thing as a pristine, non-anthropogenic landscape at this point. And that in many ways, what's allowing the most egregious things to happen to our land is the absence of humans who have an interest in protecting that land, who see that land as in some way theirs. So I really like the sheep. I really like the landscape. They're aesthetically beautiful, but there's a very, very frightening politics to the wilderness preservation, landscape aestheticization, spiritual connection to the earth theophany thing. And I hope that this is a place where we can do some questioning about.
There's a man camp finally being proposed now for the lithium mine in Nevada that's being publicly planned.
His 13-hour course is actually quite good.
Oh, thanks. Los Altos Institute has a podcast on Spotify and most of the other podcast services. And we have a totally eclectic mix of 13 episode courses. So make sure you click on the right thing, or you could get 13 episodes of tributes to original Doctor Who episodes. That's the website for the organization. Just search Los Altos Institute on Spotify or any podcast service. I don't remember. I mean, Spotify doesn't make intelligible URLs for its podcasts. We were using Anchor, but then Spotify bought Anchor, so I can no longer give out like a coherent URL for the cast. Okay.